On May 22, 1862, Charlotte Bradford found herself in Boston, completing the last of a long list of tasks in preparation for her departure for Virginia to become a matron aboard the United States Sanitary Commission's transport ships. Her last days in Massachusetts were a mad rush to visit friends, run errands, and solicit family in Duxbury to send forgotten items for her trunk. As she awaited the arrival of the floating hospital, Daniel Webster, which would carry her south to her new life, she stayed with a friend, Mrs. Whipple, at 20 Broad Street, and wrote one last letter home, in which she enclosed a small 4-penny photograph of herself. Little did she know she would not return home for over 3 years. Charlotte Bradford was born in the maritime community of Duxbury on the south shore of Massachusetts. Founded in 1637, the town experienced an economic boom in the first decades of the 19th century brought by the shipbuilding industry. Over 800 ships were built in yards lining Duxbury Bay between the late 1700s and 1840s. Charlotte's family was involved in the industry, including her uncle Ezra Weston, one of the wealthiest merchant shipbuilders in the state. Although 30 miles removed from Boston, Duxbury's prosperity created a genteel society inside the numerous stately homes built along its bustling streets. The Bradfords' home was slightly inland on Tremont Street, once a Native American trail and later the cart path used by the Bradfords' pilgrim forebears. Charlotte's grandfather, Colonel Gamaliel Bradford, had amassed a 90-acre farm here before setting off for the American Revolution, and it was on a 10-acre parcel of this farm that Charlotte's parents, Captain Gershom and Sally Bradford, built their federal-style home in 1808. Charlotte was born in this house during the height of the War of 1812, on June 20th, 1813. Because of the hostilities, her father, a merchant sea captain, was home for her birth, something he had missed with his 3 previous daughters. The family had long roots in the community, being descended of the Pilgrim governor William Bradford, as well as 2 of Duxbury's founders, John and Priscilla Alden. Charlotte grew up surrounded by an intricate network of cousins, all well aware of their unique connection to the old colony of Plymouth and to the Mayflower. Charlotte's parents, Gershom Bradford and Sally Hickling, were thrown together when 2 sets of their siblings wed. Their own wedding took place in Boston, presided over by Reverend William Emerson in 1802. Theirs was undoubtedly a love match, as their numerous letters to each other can attest. They were also as equal partners in their marriage as the early 19th century could produce, and they shared in the responsibilities of raising their 4 daughters, Mariah, born in 1804, Lucia in 1807, Elizabeth in 1809, and finally Charlotte. A son sadly died in infancy. With Captain Gershom Bradford so often away, Sally managed the household finances and the running of the Bradford small farm. She also made critical decisions about the Bradford sisters' education. The only of the Bradford sisters to marry was the eldest, Mariah. In 1830, she married her cousin, Claudius Bradford of Boston. Immediately after their wedding, Mariah and Claudius left for Kentucky, where he had secured a position as a tutor on a plantation. The couple later began their own school in Cincinnati before returning to New England, where Claudius eventually became a Unitarian minister. It is possible that through Mariah and Claudius, the Bradfords became abolitionists. However they came to the cause, by 1837 they were instrumental in forming the Duxbury Anti-Slavery Society. The Bradfords hosted many anti-slavery lecturers at their home as they came to speak on the South Shore. The family corresponded on stationery with the emblem of the cause, and the sisters signed petitions to be sent to Congress and attended anti-slavery conventions. Their work brought them into conflict at times with friends and neighbors. By the late 1830s, the Bradford family, like so many in Duxbury, was also involved in the temperance movement. Elizabeth became the secretary of the local chapter of the Union Martha Washington Relief Society. This female-led temperance organization assisted women and children whose lives had been impacted by alcoholism. They raised money by holding socials and fairs. For almost the entirety of her adult life, Charlotte Bradford adhered not only to temperance, but also vegetarianism, only breaking this strict dietary code when practicality forced her to eat beef while nursing during the Civil War. Captain Gershom Bradford died suddenly in 1844. He had retired from the sea 18 years earlier and had become active in Duxbury town politics. At the time of his death, his estate was worth over $10,000. This was divided between his wife and 4 daughters. Charlotte and her unmarried sisters, still living at home, were able to pool their resources. With some adjustments, their lifestyle changed very little. When the Civil War broke out in April 1861, Sally Bradford was 89 years old and had been infirm for a number of years. She seldom left her bedchamber. Needing to help her sisters care for their beloved mother, Charlotte had little thought of leaving Duxbury. She, like so many northern women, began doing what they could to assist the war effort. This included sewing bandages, collecting lint, and canning vegetables. In August 1861, Charlotte wrote to her sister Maria that she went to the Methodist vestry to, quote, work for the soldiers. Everything changed in October 1861 when Sally Bradford passed away. Sally's obituary in the Liberator newspaper attested to her anti-slavery work and called the Bradford's house a home for unpopular truths. Although mourning the loss of her mother, Charlotte was now free to contemplate doing more for the war effort. An opportunity presented itself in early 1862. Her niece's husband, Reverend Frederick Newman Knapp, was an administrator with the United States Sanitary Commission. Along with Frederick Law Olmsted, Knapp was in charge of fitting out large steamships to be used as floating hospitals on the Virginia Peninsula, assisting General McClellan's Army of the Potomac. As sick and wounded soldiers were brought from the battlefield to river landings, they would be loaded aboard the ships and ferried to northern hospitals. Each ship would be staffed with a surgeon in charge, 8 medical students, 20 male ward masters and nurses, and 4 lady nurse superintendents, or matrons. Upon hearing of the opportunity to become one of these matrons, Charlotte solicited Knapp to secure a position with the transport service. Initially, the matron's role was not intended to include any nursing. They were to make patients' beds, stock the kitchens, maintain locked storage areas for wine, spirits, and valuables, arrange shelves, and generally make themselves available to assist when needed. Catherine Wormley, a fellow transport matron, correctly described the type of work expected of the women when she wrote, quote, "As far as I can judge, our duty is to be very much that of a housekeeper," end quote. However, once on board the vessels, the matrons found themselves taking on a far greater role. After the Battle of Fair Oaks in early June 1862, nurses worked for days with little time for rest. Charlotte wrote in her diary on June 4th, quote, "Received and fed that evening 470 wounded, which kept us till 12. Did not know it was Sunday until after I went to bed. I got so much exhausted that I did not know as I shall be able to stand it," end quote. By the end of the summer, the Union Army was taking over the transport vessels. One by one, the female matrons went back to their homes or on to other relief work. Charlotte was uncertain of her fate. Despite the many aspects of the transport service that were almost intolerable, the horrific sights, the fatiguing work, the boredom between assignments, the scarce and almost inedible food, Charlotte had experienced a sense of independence and purpose aboard the ships that she was loath to give up. She viewed the end of the campaign with regret, writing in her diary, quote, "No one can tell how sorry I shall be to give up this service," end quote. In September of 1862, Charlotte found herself at a crossroads. After disembarking from the schooner St. Mark in Baltimore, she made her way to Washington, D.C. She was directed to the office of Dorothea Dix, the superintendent of Army nurses. Dix was a complicated figure. She had spent the antebellum years fighting for prison and insane asylum reform, but in Washington she earned the nickname Dragon Dix. Male surgeons resented her, as most viewed female nurses as a nuisance. This was in large part due to their lack of formal training. While holding potential nurses to a strict age and moral standard, Dix required little in the way of experience. According to former Duxbury resident and union nurse Mary Livermore, quote, "Many of the women Dix accepted because they were sufficiently old and ugly proved unfit for the position and a disgrace to their sex," end quote. Because she met all of Dix's criteria for nurses, coupled with her recent nursing experience, Charlotte was hired immediately and sent to work at the Armory Square Hospital. But she soon found hospital work to be markedly different from her experiences in the transport service. She had come to expect a degree of deference while aboard the ships. At the Armory Square Hospital, however, she was soon disabused of any notion that her presence was wanted. On her first day as an Army nurse at the Armory Square, she sat for 3 hours in an office before being sent to a ward, whereupon she was, quote, "put on duty, or rather, told to go to work," end quote. The next day was no better, finding, quote, "the change from the respect with which we were treated on the boat was rather striking," end quote. It took a week before anyone remembered her name. It only took a few more days before she was dismissed for incompetence. Charlotte had become openly hostile to a surgeon named Dr. Reed, whom she suspected was negligent. This conflict was not unique, but as in Charlotte's case, it often led to dismissal. Most nurses were allowed to do little nursing in the modern professional sense of the word. They were required to do the highly gendered tasks of washing, dressing, and feeding patients. They also wrote for and read to patients. In some instances, female nurses, including Charlotte, were allowed to dress wounds, but that was not the norm. Despite the medical personnel's dislike for women in the wards, most soldiers were glad of their presence. Luckily, Charlotte's dismissal at Armory Square did not end her career as a hospital nurse. Dorothea Dix had ample experience with disgruntled surgeons. She promptly posted her to the Seminary Hospital in Georgetown. This former girls' school had been converted to care for officers. The building still stands today. Throughout the fall and into the winter of 1862, Charlotte worked ceaselessly at hospitals throughout the D.C. area. Eventually she, like so many other nurses, succumbed to illness. While caring for a number of typhoid fever patients, she most likely contracted the disease. Her symptoms included a fever that lasted for 2 weeks and left her weak and unable to leave her bed. She convalesced at the Sanitary Commission's Home for Nurses, run by a family friend named Mrs. Caldwell. During the early months of 1863, as she continued to recover, Charlotte frequently visited the home of her niece, Lucia Bradford Knapp, and her niece's husband, Frederick Newman Knapp, in Washington. With Knapp now working as the administrator of the United States Sanitary Commission Special Relief Department in D.C., he had moved his family to the city to be with him. It was also during this time that her friend and former fellow transport nurse, Amy Bradley, left her position as matron at the Sanitary Commission's Home for Soldiers, leaving a vacancy perfectly suited to Bradford's talents. The Home for Soldiers was a place where those furloughed by the Army could receive food, shelter, and hospital care, as well as assistance with paperwork, back pay, and train tickets as they made their way north. During the course of the war, Mary Livermore estimated that over 800,000 soldiers were entertained and 4.5 million meals and 1 million nights' lodgings were gratuitously furnished at the home. It was also a sanctuary where, quote, the private soldier could go and remain for a few days without being prey of the unprincipled villains who neglected no opportunity of fleecing every man connected with the Army, end quote. After accepting the position as matron, Charlotte's first days at the home were spent cleaning and putting her own brand of order to the place. She immediately liked her room, writing that it had one of the prettiest views in Washington. Her days were hectic as she tended to men often too sick to travel or offered shelter to those waiting days to get their transportation papers. Unfortunately, many men died while in this intermediate condition. The home's hospital also served as an additional space when army hospitals became too crowded. In 1863 alone, over 900 very sick patients arrived at the home hospital. 61 sadly died. In addition to her duties as matron of the Home for Soldiers and its adjacent hospital, Charlotte also managed the Home for Wives and Mothers a few doors down at 380 North Capitol Street. This facility housed the wives, mothers, and sisters of wounded soldiers who were flocking to the Capitol to care for their loved ones in Union hospitals. They often arrived, quote, utterly ignorant of the cost of the journey and of obtaining board or lodging, even for a day or two in the city, utterly destitute and helpless, end quote. The Home for Wives and Mothers offered them not only shelter and food, but also assistance locating their family members, or sadly, their remains. During the course of its existence, it is estimated that this department provided rest and sustenance to thousands of women. When she needed assistance, Charlotte sent for her sister Lucia. Lucia remained for 6 months, and it is through Lucia's notes that we learn firsthand of some of the desperate cases that came to the home. A woman comes from a distance in great trouble about her boy. The boy left her without her consent, too young to enlist, but left home in the same regiment with his father. She wants to go to the regiment to find him, but she cannot. A woman is almost deranged with fatigue and anxiety in nursing her husband, has come in for a little rest now that he is dead. A woman who came to nurse her son has been sick several days. She is very sick. Her husband and daughter arrive in the morning. She dies the evening of that day. Interestingly, there were at least 2 female soldiers who made their way to the home. One was Fanny Lee. She had been discovered in the spring of 1864 after she had fallen ill. She told Charlotte that she was a war widow with no friends. In actuality, she was a single woman who had enlisted in the Ohio 6th Cavalry with her cousin. Once home, Fanny Lee wrote a letter to Bradford. Now married, with her hair growing out and fully recovered from her illness, she wrote she was, quote, now a soldier for life in the Brigade of Matrimony, end quote. Charlotte remained at the Home for Soldiers and its female department for the remainder of the war, not returning to Duxbury until the last veteran made his way through the home in 1865. In 1867, Linus P. Brockett and Mary C. Vaughan wrote Women's Work in the Civil War, in which a small chapter is dedicated to Charlotte's work. She is described as, quote, a woman of extraordinary attainments and culture, as well as thoroughly refined and ladylike in her manners. Her chapter may be smaller than those of her companions, but this speaks to her reticence more than her accomplishments. The authors argue that her exemplary service renders her public property, but one can only imagine Charlotte politely refusing to offer any personal information. Charlotte remained in Duxbury after the war, living with her sisters, Lucia and Elizabeth, in the house built by her parents. As their savings dwindled, they became increasingly frugal, but always found enough to spend on books. In 1890, when Charlotte was 76 years old and quite infirm, she applied for and received a much welcome pension of $12 a month from the federal government for her nursing experience. Sister Elizabeth passed the same year. 3 years later, in 1893, Charlotte and Lucia Bradford died within weeks of each other. Charlotte's grave in Mayflower Cemetery is decorated with a Grand Army of the Republic Civil War Veterans Medallion. In 2017, the Bradford House Museum at 931 Tremont Street was reimagined to tell the story of the remarkable Bradford sisters and their role in 19th century women's history. It explores their work in both the anti-slavery and temperance movements, as well as Charlotte's Civil War career. If you would like to learn more about Charlotte Bradford or the Bradford House Museum, contact us at www.duxburyhistory.org.